Hello, I've recently published a book called Foreshadowed, Malevich's Black Square and its Precursors. The book is about the painting Black Square produced by the Russian artist Kasimir Malevich in 1915. The painting was completely shocking in its own time. It made no sense to anybody. Even 100 years later, it is a perplexing picture. It was revolutionary with regard to art history as a whole, and it was considered by everybody, Malevich included, to be unprecedented. I would like to demonstrate that despite the fact that it is, in an art historical context, unprecedented, there were in fact many precursors in diverse fields, from humour to mourning to metaphysics to epistemology, theories of knowledge. And in this short film, I would like to show you some of the black squares that appeared in historical context before Malevich embarked on his own great masterpiece.
So the first book I'd like to show you is by Malevich himself. It's called From Cubism and Futurism to Suprematism, and he published it shortly after he produced the Black Square painting. In the book, he describes, well, he doesn't describe it, he gives an incantation about the necessity of his own style, suprematism, how it superseded Cubism and Futurism and really constituted a consummation of art history altogether. It's a very cheaply produced object. The text is short, but it has got a couple of illustrations in it, one of the black square itself and one of the black circle, which one wit of the period called the full stop in the history of art, something which I think would have pleased him very much. So this is a seminal text in the history of Malevich's own style called Suprematism. The next object I'd like to show you is from the 17th century. It's this tiny little book, and it is a book of laments. It's written to commemorate the execution of Charles I in 1649. It's called Regale Lectum Miseriae, or A Kingly Bed of Misery, in which is contained a dream with an elegy upon the martyrdom of Charles, late King of England, of blessed memory. And it's a very intense and concentrated series of reflections on the late king. And one can sort of get a feeling of the way it was used as it sat in the hands of one of his friends or colleagues. But it does have this very extraordinary characteristic in the second half of the book, when we move into the elegy proper, and that is these pages of mourning. Every other page from here to the end of the book has this extraordinary page of black ink printed on it, accompanying in its feeling the intensity of the words on the opposite page. This one reads, "My shivering body, oh what stormy weather was that which violently tossed me hither? Where am I now? What rubicundious light is this that bloodies my amazed sight? What reformation this that's newly bred and turns my white into so deep a red?" And so it goes on, and each page is very, very different in its quality of blackness, which adds an element of miniature drama to the sequence of images and gives them this fantastic feeling of intensity. Can mountains shrink away and not observed? Or can there be a day without a sun? Or can there be a night without some darkness? Can there be a light put out unwanted? Or can murder be committed upon sacred majesty and not lamented? So one feels it's very, very earnest and concentrated at the same time, and the pathos of the sequence is really quite impressive. Now, this quality of intensity was characteristic of the 17th century, but by the 18th century it had become a bit gross to express oneself so passionately. It was seen to be more becoming to have some restraint and some decorum, and that's reflected in the next book that I'd like to show you, which is in fact a kind of spoof on the one I have just shown you. This is an edition of The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy, written by Lawrence Sterne in about 1760, and it's a book of rambling reminiscences. It's half comic. Now, at one point, the parson Yorick dies, and he is commemorated with a black page in the manner of the earlier elegy that I've just shown you. And in this case, there's one on the front and one on the back. So we see this mourning is really practiced with in a slightly ridiculing way. It's a literary convention that Sterne is actually enjoying subverting, and this is characteristic of the novel as a whole. And I'll just show you that by way of context how that manifests. The book is in its early edition split into many different volumes. Another page, for instance, has some marbling in it. Marbling was usually used at the front or the back of a book, but here Sterne has included some marbling in the middle of the book, most unconventional, and he talks about it here in the text. He says it's a motley emblem of his work. That is a reflection of the confusion into which he feels thrown by the circumstances of life. And each page in these early editions was unique and hand produced. We'll come back to that in other editions. Another volume from the same book also has a play with literary conventions, and here we have, for instance, some blank pages. Chapter 38 has absolutely nothing in it, nor does chapter 39. So again, Lawrence Sterne is being pretty avant-garde by the period, by the standards of his time. In another context, he's talking about the timeline, aware of his own inclination to digress. He's actually drawn some lines which reflect the way his mind works. It sort of keeps sort of going off track, and occasionally it even goes backwards in time. So some very interesting sort of graphic representations of the perception of time, which are all part of this extended literary exercise. Now, Lawrence Sterne's novel was produced numerous times. Here's an example of the same narrative from 1790. In this case, we have black pages facing each other at the appropriate time. So you get a sort of double page, and they appear, I think they're a little bit like tombstones in a graveyard. You just come up against them, and there they are with their faded text. They just stand as monuments to transience. Another example of the same tome is interesting too. Here we have a later example. It was produced in Paris, in fact, in 1832. It's part of the Foreign Library of Baudry. Now this is interesting because, though it's in English, the printer has obviously been a little bit economic in his treatment of the conventions of the original. And for the black page in this book, we have this kind of netting effect. It looks like a piece of wire, like a wire fence. You can see it's not completely black. So we've lost a little bit of the sublimity, you could say, of the black page tradition in this more elegant but perhaps less effective tradition. And incidentally, when we look at the marbled page, you see it's completely different. Obviously, the publisher couldn't take the trouble to insert a handmade marble page, so he's created a kind of brickwork effect. And interestingly, in the text here, Sterne refers to this page as the motley emblem of his work, and he says it's very inscrutable, and just as inscrutable as the other page, the black page. But in this book, he calls it the checkered page, probably because the convention of reproduction in this edition is more checkered than plain, and so the word has become checkered here. And this is interesting too, because other editions of the book, as we see here, this time a French translation, the book was extremely popular, was translated into numerous languages. The person who produced this French edition took it from the edition that I've just shown you with that changed word, checkered, and he's actually created a totally checkered page for the black page. And so we can see that the literary convention has really taken off in its own direction, and the original feeling of mourning, that sublimity that was present in the early editions and of course in the 17th century mourning books, has been completely lost. Malevich would surely have enjoyed the funerary implications of Tristram Shandy's Black Page. In fact, when he died in 1935, his body was laid under one of his paintings of the Black Square as a symbol of the portal through which he would pass into the beyond. And Stern was known in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. One theorist, Viktor Shklovsky, talked about him as a precedent for the avant-garde, or the literary devices that he used were picked up by avant-garde writers. In fact, Malevich himself enjoyed some of the absurdity that you could say was precedented in Lawrence Stern's work. X-rays have shown that under the Black Square itself there appear to have been two earlier paintings, one of which was painted in Malevich's Cubo-Futurist style, in which the world is absurdly disrupted and broken down into an assembly of fragmented parts. Now, this element of absurdity or humour also hovered around the use of black pages in 19th century books, and I'd like to show you some examples of those now. Actually, the first thing I'd like to show you is a page from a journal called Le Charivari. It was produced in Paris in the 1830s onwards, and it specialised in caricatures and satires and cartoons, and in the 1840s it began to produce caricatures of paintings that were exhibited in the annual salons, which had been running in France since the 18th century. And on this page we have a horizontal painting of a wave that is quite enormous. Then below that we have two portraits which are obviously absurd, especially the back view here on the left. In the middle there is a picture that is so small that it's almost invisible. The frame is absolutely enormous. There's a child's drawing, and then at the very bottom we have a magnificent black painting. The inscription says it's an effect of night, and it was produced by a man called Mr. Robertson. And it's obviously a ludicrous concept. It was meant to represent a picture that is so dark that nothing could be seen at all. And this notion of darkness is one that we will see crops up again and again in 19th century comic images that make use of this black square or this black rectangle as a kind of visual trope. The image I'd like to show you now is from a German journal called Fliegende Blätter, Fleeting or Flowing Leaves, from 1867. The journal is full of stories, songs, anecdotes, jokes, and is very richly illustrated, often with the most ridiculous caricatures. The image I would like to show you is of a huge black painting. It's being viewed by a group of stuffy bourgeois people, one of them with a set of binoculars, and it's being guarded by a halberdier. And the group say to him, "What are you doing with that pike?" He replies, "Keep back. A picture like this, an effect painting, is meant to be seen from a distance. The further back you are, the better." The picture is a chaotic scribble of lines reflecting the state of confusion on the part of the viewers. It was quite precocious to think in terms of effect painting in 1867, if only to ridicule it. This was 7 years before the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, and Impressionism was, of course, the epitome of effect painting, caused something of a furore. Interestingly, the first exhibition was held in the studio of the photographer Nadar, and Nadar was the maker of the next image that I'd like to show you. Interestingly, before he became a photographer, Nadar was a caricaturist, and he produced cartoons for the Comic Review. In this volume of editions from 1848, we get an impression of the kind of work that he was producing. It's not dissimilar in some ways to the Fliegende Blätter that I showed you just a moment ago. One of his favourite figures was Monsieur Réac, whose public and private life he traces in the journal. Monsieur Réac was a businessman and a con man. Here we see him on the right, being pursued by his clients. At one point, he confronts one of them and tries to communicate that the situation is totally in hand and perfectly clear. And the perfect clarity is represented by a scribbled black space, not dissimilar in some ways to the painting I showed you just a moment ago. Here on the right, we can see the noses of his clients becoming ever longer. The next thing I'd like to show you is also about a raffish character. It was produced by Amédée de Naux, nicknamed Cham, in 1839, so before the Nadar, but it's also about a hapless person, Mr. La Jeunesse, yellowness, and it tells some of his tales. He's a Mr. Bean-like character, constantly getting into scrapes. It's a very beautiful little book. He's about to go to bed. He receives a knock at the door and he meditates on what to do about it. Interestingly, the time he spends thinking is given in quite a lot of detail. So, for instance, here he waits for 3 hours and 25 minutes before deciding what to do. And then an hour later and some minutes, he decides to put the key into the lock. He receives this letter, which also takes him quite a bit of time to process. Then eventually he opens the letter and reads it. By this time we're at 2 in the morning. And then he tramples on the letter to make it take up less space, and he puts it in the drawer. And all is well, and he's about to go to bed. He blows out his candle and he is plunged into darkness. And here are the marvellous representations of Monsieur La Jeunesse. Here having got into his bed, and here wondering why there's no pillow in the bed. So again, some confusion expressed here, and he soon discovers when he relights the candle that he has in fact got into a chest of drawers. So this explains the situation, and so it goes on from one absurd adventure to another. But interesting to see how darkness is expressed as blackness. This is something that again will reappear in other comic books of this kind. Here, for instance, we have a book of sayings and songs by Count Franz Graf von Potschi, produced in 1845. It's very beautifully illustrated, shows quite a bit of influence from the Middle Ages. Here, for instance, we have a scene that resembles Dürer's engraving from 1513, The Night, Death and the Devil. At some point, we encounter a group of puppeteers, and von Potschi was himself a puppeteer. He started the Marionette Theatre in Munich. The story tells of the Chinese emperor and his group of acolytes who imitate him and pay obeisance to him all the time. At some point, the proceedings become rather dull. The emperor starts yawning, and all his followers yawn in imitation of him. Eventually, it becomes too boring for words, and the audience breaks out into a fight. The lights go out, and they end up in total darkness, which is represented beautifully here by a black rectangle. The next thing I'd like to show you perpetuates the theme of the black square or rectangle as a representation of a state of mind. This time it's not chaos or confusion, but ignorance. As you can see, the book's in terrible condition, but at least it has the marbling in the right place, and very splendid it is too. The book's an atlas of universal history, produced by Edward Quinn in 1830. What makes it unusual is that only those parts of the world that were known at any given time, to Western historians that is, are shown. The rest is black. Here we see the first page representing the time of the deluge, believed to have happened in the year 2348 BC, when man's ignorance was at its greatest. As the author explains in his preface, he used this device to give a sense of proportion to the relativity of knowledge. Malevich's black square is also a vision of ignorance. of what the 15th century philosopher Nicholas of Cusa called divine ignorance. That is to say, the non-dual consciousness that transcends the mind, that claims or aspires to know. The next thing I'd like to show you is also about history, this time a history of Holy Russia. It is, however, comedic. It was written by Gustave Doré in 1854 during the Crimean War, in which Britain, France and the Ottoman Empire were pitted against Russia. And it is a satire. Amazingly, the history starts with a black section, which is described as the origin of the history of Russia lost in the darkness of antiquity. So it corresponds perfectly with Malevich's vision of the black square as the foundation of knowledge and consciousness, one might say. The book continues in a completely comedic fashion. We have the ancestors of the Russian people here, polar bears, who at some point meet up with a very fetching looking walrus here, and their progeny constitutes the Russians. The book goes on in this like manner. On this page we have some antics that really approximate Tristram Shandy. The chopping up of words, the spilling of ink onto the page itself, and something also resembling the black square again. Page 3 gives us several blank rectangles. This is, according to Doré, because this part of Russian history is so boring, there's nothing to say. Nevertheless, he didn't feel he could just skip it, and so he's getting some kind of representation to it. Of course, one could develop the sort of conceptual implications here with regard to the representation of nothingness quite easily. There's another page which does the same thing, which is very fascinating. And here we have a page that is completely blank. And the inscription at the bottom takes us back to 1542 to 1580, following the reign of Ivan the Terrible. In front of his crimes, let us merely glance in order to get a general impression of what is going on. So the book is really quite fantastically pertinent as a comment on Russian history and as a kind of precursor for some of Malevich's thinking on the subject. Not that he will have known this book. This particular page has an uncanny resemblance to some of Malevich's white-on-white paintings, and also poignantly, I think there's a possibility of linking it to some of the demonstrations that we've been seeing taking place in Russia in recent times. The next document I'd like to show you also relates to history, to Russian history. It's a supplement to The Graphic, published in London in 1875, and it documents the war strength of European powers in 1874. It's not, incidentally, reproduced in my book. It is a very fascinating document, and the black square is, of course, extremely eye-catching from the outset. It represents Russia and the territories that belonged to the expanded Russian Empire at the time. So the central black square represents Russia itself. Solid black represents Russia, it reads, beneath the whole, and then the shaded grey area around it includes the territories under the rule of the Russian Tsars at the time. These include parts of Poland, parts of Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Finland, and other areas. To the left, we see the British Empire. Great Britain and Ireland are very tiny in relation to the vast area of its colonies and dependencies, 8 million square miles, you can see, slightly larger than the 7,600,000 square miles that constitutes the totality of the Russian lands at this time. Of course, it's really a coincidence that Russia should look like Malevich's black square in this image, but one cannot help but find some kind of resonance there. The last books that I'd like to show you relate to metaphysical aspects of Malevich's black square. Malevich was fascinated by the notion of the fourth dimension, which had been disseminated in Russia by P.D. Uspensky in around 1912. This book, A Primer of Higher Space by Claude Bragton, was published in 1912. In this edition, published a little bit later in 1929, we also have his text Man the Square, which he wrote in 1913. In this text, he explores the notion of dimensions, and the concept he comes up with that is pertinent to the black square is the notion that man in his higher nature is in fact a cube living on a higher dimension of existence, but when he passes through the planar dimension of our current experience, the cube is only registered as a series of planes. We never experience ourselves as the cube, we experience ourselves in the surface of the plane. Here you see A is the individual man and B is a kind of personal consciousness of that man as it is experienced in life. And there are many drawings he produces of this phenomenon. Here, for instance, we have one in which the cubes of humanity are seen to be passing through the surface of consciousness, and they register there as a series of different erratic shapes. The pure man, the complete man, someone who is whole, will pass through the plane of this world perpendicular to it, and therefore he will register himself as a square rather than as one of these irregular geometrical forms which most of us are destined to experience. This particular image looks remarkably like one of Malevich's suprematist paintings from more or less the same time. The idea that humanity has only a very limited experience of its true potential became very popular at the beginning of the 20th century, and many people wrote books about it. Efforts were made to reconcile scientific and spiritual approaches to the subject of consciousness. This is one example written by William Coode Adams in 1927. It's called A Primer of Occult Physics. At one point, Coode Adams describes how the totality of man's possible experience is like a square, but we only get to experience it in cross sections that are limited by our current state of consciousness, something that I think Malevich would have understood very clearly indeed.
So there are some examples of black squares and rectangles that predate Malevich's own black square. There are plenty more examples. If you'd like to find out more, have a look at Foreshadowed, Malevich's black square and its precursors. Thanks for watching.